Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to move swiftly on so we give you an opportunity to give us your thoughts, Secretary-General. I mean, the Commonwealth presumably has got quite a stake in this development agenda. I'd be interested to know what the angle
Absolutely.
is.
Well, I'm delighted to hear from Shriti that development is being mainstreamed in G20, because if it were not happening, you'd wonder what the point of creating this institution was. We have always regarded the G20 as a major global opportunity. Shortly after it arose, I contacted my counterpart in the Francophonie and President Diouf and said we must act together and utilize this opportunity. And we've been doing that ever since, because the Francophonie and the Commonwealth put together constitute more than half the world's population of member states. And indeed, if you look at only developing countries, much more than that. And we wrote an op-ed, and the title of that op-ed was G20 or T20. Is it the group of 20 or trustees 20? Because 90% of the world's GDP is inside the G20, but 90% of the world's countries are outside. So what can this group of 90% say which makes sense to the other 90% which is outside? There's of course another context, which is that you can't be sanguine about failed states anymore. We talk about human communities and what's happening to human communities. And our starting point is a very simple one. No matter what the size of your population, other attributes, every state entity, every human community deserves a place in the sun equally with everyone else. But if you were to take a theoretical security-related view of what happens to states that don't succeed as different from human beings who don't thrive, then you have to worry about creating a bacillus in the world where uncivil society can stick and find a home and a habitat. So you have a problem which is both human as well as a problem related to global security and linked with it. I'm delighted to see that Simon is here, because Simon and the Commonwealth worked very closely. I requested Prime Minister Gordon Brown if he'll chair a mini summit, which is the first time held in the Commonwealth, on the question of the reform of multilateral institutions. And I said the reason for that is, if I ask anyone else, it'll sound like a G77 petition. But if you do, it'll enhance the credibility of it. Now, I'm a great admirer of Gordon Brown and his thinking on the ethical dimension of what needs to be done to that part of the world, which is not catching up very well. He agreed to do it. And we produced, I think, a very important document. The heart of it was inclusiveness and the sense of equity and fairness, which must guide global affairs. The question is, having made that pronouncement, how do you go about doing anything about it? Well, G20 was the vehicle for us. And we've been relentlessly pursuing the G20 and pouncing upon it, no matter where the meeting was held, particularly when it was held in London. The Prime Minister heard from us, and Mark Malloch-Brown heard from us. And I'm very grateful that both of them, after the meeting, wrote to me independently and said, I hope you're satisfied with what we were able to do. Now, but the biggest breakthrough for us came when Prime Minister Harper invited us, both of us, and we had a 40-minute meeting. Prime Minister doesn't always meet everyone individually. He met both of us. And President Diouf said, in order to save time, we sing from the same song sheet, so I'll ask Ambassador Sharma to speak, so I did. And I started by saying that, look, not everything that I'm going to say is, I know in advance, many parts of it you don't believe in. Maybe personally you don't believe in as a country either. But these things have to be said. And what we said was that first thing you have to worry about is liquidity, access to funds, export finance, debt overhang. In other words, the poor, the small states being hit once again by a crisis they have no hand in. The worst example of it, of course, is environment, where countries with almost zero carbon footprint are the first threatened with going under and being threatened with with their existence, like Maldives and the other Pacific states. But we've had four crises. Environment goes on, finance, I suppose, is still going on. You've got fuel, you've got food. These small states, 32 out of 54 constituencies are small, are not contributors, but the first to be affected. And then digitally there was a conference, and at the end I said I'm appalled that we've had 2 days of conversation, and everyone's talking about green shoots which are visible, but they're all visible in industrial societies and emerging societies. But let me tell you something. If a wheel isn't squeaking, it doesn't mean it's not coming off. And there's a silent death which is threatened. If you don't worry about small communities, they don't impact on you otherwise, but you have an obligation anyway. So the points we made to the Prime Minister Harper was, one, we need the biggest global scandal in the world today is 500,000 maternal deaths which are recorded, not the unrecorded ones. So our campaign in G20 should be 500,000 midwives. You can't do that remotely. I think women once in their lives want this support and we can't give them. It's the biggest disgrace on the human community. The second thing we said was, we are happy that the aid levels are holding on more or less with great effort. The credit goes to those countries that are even increasing theirs. The UK is one of them. They've got a very clear plan for the next 3 years. But I don't think it's going to make a huge difference to the sum which is available. The World Bank, I think, had said you need $315 billion to make for the shortfall from outside. Where is it going to come from? I say you simply need to have a working group on innovative sources of funding and non-sovereign funding. You have to give respectability to the idea. Forget about that you yourself as Canada are not in favor of taxing financial transactions. They're not saying that. And you can have, multiple geometry here. Anyone can, and I've got a whole menu of what could be looked at, from SDRs to selling gold from the IMF, and what passengers pay when they catch flights. But you have to give the respectability to the idea that that really is the source from which you're going to get year after year significant addition to funds. And so these were the points that we made. Now, he said, look, these are very important points. What I suggest is, can you give us papers on this? So I said, well, here they are. They said, all right, we give it to all the Sherpas. We'll work on it. And after that, he wrote me a letter saying that the intervention we made a very big difference. And indeed, you do see in the communique a reference to innovative funding, to maternal health. We recommended a working group on resources and development, but we've got one on development, and that's great. The other thing which we want, and which Canada is helping us with, and Sarkozy, as the next one, has already said, yes, I'll do it for you. We're trying with the Koreans. The Korean president didn't come, but we spoke to somebody, which is that before every G20 meeting, I think at least the two of us should meet the chair. We don't want to be on the table. We just want to make sure that our concerns are on the table. And if we make it into a habit, then we can also distill through a catchment area the points which we wish to make on behalf of the 90% that are not represented here. And I hope it will work. I think it's working in that direction. I'm not sure what we'll do with Korea because time is running out. But I think the idea is being accepted. The other thing we're trying to do is this overlap, which we have, very fortunate, because a quarter of the G20 belongs to the Commonwealth, 5 countries. You throw in Francophonie, France, you've got another one. So we want to use them in various ministerial conferences. And last week, we had a few days ago in Fund Bank meeting in Washington, we had a meeting, which is something which I proposed. And I said, your offshore meetings, finance ministers, are not working. So Zolik came, Strauss-Kahn came, all the 5 country G20 Commonwealth members, finance ministers were there. From 2 days, we cut it into 3 hours. And we said, this is what we would like to see happen in G20 if you were there. We're trying to do it with other ministerial meetings as well. Now, very quickly, what is it we would like to see in this group that has finally been created in trade? Firstly, they need to get the philosophy right of what each wants to do. Shriti just now said, not aid, fine, we understand that, otherwise all your time will be taken on aid levels. But what is the philosophy of aid? How important is aid? What are we as members ready to do in this regard? All that must come in. First, accelerating trade, in particular exports from the poorest, smallest, and most vulnerable to OECD markets. Without trade, these economies cannot grow. At best, they can manage poverty, but will they be able to escape it? By calling for a prompt, favorable conclusion, it's an old thing, DDR, Doha Development Round, but it's important, a rule-based system for these smaller countries, with increased duty-free, quota-free access, and so on, including key exports to these countries and renewing G20's call to avoid protectionism. And I see that the Indian Prime Minister has expressed a great deal of concern about the next meeting in this regard. By setting targets for increased aid for trade and for increased volumes of trade finance for these countries, it's really ironic that because of the pressure on banks, even that which you can export, you can't get credit for on a multi-year basis, and establishing an automatic financing facility for the most trade vulnerable countries. Indebtedness, I think, we need to be spoken of. Small, highly vulnerable countries, which have seen their debt burdens, debt servicing obligations increase significantly as a result of the global crisis. The Commonwealth has set out a number of possible options for further exploration, including swapping some external debt for new sources of climate finance, enhancing commercial debt buybacks, extending bilateral debt relief, and establishing a temporary debt moratorium. I think this working group can usefully look at these and other options and galvanize solutions which are internationally acceptable. Resilience, Shriti just now mentioned. If someone put a gun to my head and said, what does Commonwealth stand for? Give me two words. I'll say legitimacy and resilience. Because we believe that if you, through your own internal strengths, are not able to withstand the pressures and the shocks that will come to you inevitably, you're constantly on Band-Aid, then you're not a sustainable society. But on resilience, we've done an enormous amount of work. And for many years, through our experience in resilience, we have developed a methodology, framework, and index for resilience building. This work is into its second generation of analysis and implementation, and we are pleased that the UN and the World Bank have adopted this methodology recently. The working group would do well to consult with the Commonwealth on this experience and this framework. It has 6 pillars, not 9. Macroeconomic stability, efficiency at micro level, which is markets, good governance, social development and cohesion, and sound environmental management. Fourth, aid, on which I have already spoken. Now, there are issues which are of a philosophical nature. Just now, Simon also knows this, I chaired the working group which led to the Monterey Consensus in New York. And I've seen the latest August report, UNSG update on the Monterey, which basically speaks, and one of the points it makes is about aid darlings. And the points it makes is the top 10 aid receivers today consume 38% of aid. 8 years ago, the top 10 consumed only 12%. Now we know the argument about spreading it thinly, but starving aid recipients is another issue. And I think is aid, I'm not saying it's like drip irrigation, but where you need growth, you need a bit of aid as well. And you saw from the Growth Commission that they could not find, it was released in Chatham House, I was there, a single economic measure which the 16-odd countries they investigated with high growth they could come up with. But they found, unsought for, a social measure. Each of those countries had invested heavily in health and in education. And they found an invisible political measure, that they were determined to get out of the poverty trap. This is also a Commonwealth lesson in many ways, and I hope that when this question is dealt with by the G20, the totality of the picture will also be admitted. The fifth key is innovative sources of finance. I've already mentioned this. Every country has their own reason for not wanting to do something. They may have the possibility of doing something. I think Soros, I read in one of his books, he said, global public goods can be financed by global means. I think it's an important idea. But I think the G20 can help enormously by giving, as I said, respectability to the search. In fact, I have suggested to Prime Minister Harper creating a working group, especially in this field. And I am prepared to talk to President Diouf of creating a working group and having the right people to work on it between the Commonwealth and the Francophonie. The last question is climate change. I think in the CHOGM, or the Summit of Commonwealth, which we had last year, the desirability and the necessity of a fast start finance mechanism, I think they mentioned $10 billion there, was admitted. But I think many of these countries are at a critical point now. And we need to find practical measures in capacity building, which is what we're trying to do. You can get money from 18 different funds, but I don't think the countries that need it know which is the first form to be filled to get there. The other thing which we find is that in the end, if you look at the small print, in the end it's some kind of concessional finance. 3 days ago I had a discussion with the president of the Maldives, and he says, I can't find a fund which gives me much of grant money. All of these are concessional. They're adding to my debt profile. I think an answer has to be found to a proper balance between concessional finance and grant money. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Great. Since we're going to sort of lose you in about 10 minutes, I wanted to give people the opportunity to react specifically to what the Secretary-General has been saying, and then we'll come in and have a broader range of discussion. We have two. Simon there and the lady at the back. So Simon first.
I've just come back from Korea on G20 business, and I wanted to say a couple of things quickly, that to acknowledge the leadership that Shriti has provided, and also you, Secretary-General, through the Commonwealth, but also to pay tribute to you, Alison, and Dirk and ODI for what you've done in helping to raise this development agenda. I think it's been extremely impressive. It's really important to recognise the development agenda, but all the other stuff on the G20 agenda is also about development. All the financial stability, the vulnerability fund, the banking regulation, Basel III, all of that has very big impacts on developing countries. We mustn't put development in a box. The seminar I went to had a slogan which was from crisis resolution to global steering committee, I think. And that raised lots of big questions for us in the room, including some UN people, about what exactly the G20 does. Shriti gave us a very good narrative about development and growth, but the question of what exactly the G20 will do about it, I think, is a very interesting question. I'd like to hear some thoughts on. You know, you can issue pronouncements, you can hold each other to account, you can build trust between countries. So that's my first question. The second question is where the boundaries lie for the G20. And Shriti, you said very clearly the G20 is an economic agenda. It was amazing to me to discover that the G20 isn't going to discuss climate change, like 3 weeks before Cancun. Even if it doesn't, of course, do the job that Cancun has to do, there surely has to be a discussion about this kind of global issue amongst leaders in private, with a very brief summary in the communique that then builds momentum. And are there any other issues like that which are on the fringe of economic interpolitical that are worth discussing? When I came back from Korea, I wrote a mission statement for the G20, and it's on my blog, and it says some of these things.
Let me put a question to the lady at the back there, and then Stephanie, and then I'm just going to get some quick reactions, particularly from you, Kamalesh.
I want to bring the case of people who, the ethnic minorities who are oppressed in some countries and who are screened from the rest of the world by sovereignty. I want to take the case of Sri Lanka.
Do you have a specific question rather
yes,
than a long comment?
Yes. Oppressed countries look up to, oppressed people look up to intergovernmental bodies for justice. And in the case of the Commonwealth, at least in the last 5 years in the Rajapaksa government, UN officials have been vilified. UN rapporteurs were prevented from going there. ICG people, International Crisis Group, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they have all been vilified. And the Commonwealth, in spite of all this, the Commonwealth has been very silent. Okay. Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative has been condemning the Commonwealth.
Okay, thank you.
And
is there a question specifically on the agenda we're talking about now?
Yes, so if a body like the Commonwealth ignores the oppressed people for 5-6 years, in fact, contrary to the principle, Commonwealth principle, which states that any member of CMAG can hold only a maximum of 2 consecutive terms, that is 4 years. Sri Lanka has been, in spite of all the human rights violations, holding 6 years. So the oppressed people are oppressed by intergovernmental bodies.
Thank you. With all due respect, I'm going to pass on to a question specifically on G20 and the issues that we've been discussing.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the excellent presentations. I wanted to build in my first question on what Simon said about the links with the global agenda. I mean, to what extent can developing countries and the poorest countries press the G20 to get their act together and agree on how they can recover growth? Because we have now a situation in Europe where country after country is slashing government spending, and we're at quite a serious risk of, I think, a possible repeat of the 30s, even though on a smaller magnitude. And the discussions are not really leading to some kind of agreement. And so it's nice that they talk about development, but I think one of the best things they could do for development is to provide a growth-based environment. So I don't know whether the pressure from the non-developed G20 could be helpful in this task. Secondly, I just wanted to ask, the Secretary-General explained very well how he and the leader of the Francophonie were representing the poorest countries. And I was just wondering whether there couldn't be a more formal situation, because I think the broadening from the G8 to the G20 has represented a very important change. And when one listened to both speakers, and particularly to Shriti, one could see the way development is being approached is influenced by people like India and China and their valuable experience. But if we're going to be talking a lot about the poor countries, shouldn't they sit at the table? So shouldn't the Commonwealth sit at the table, or some other mechanism of representation?
Great. Before I bring you in, Duncan, I'm going to give you an opportunity maybe to answer that particular question about
yeah, sure.
poor countries.
Yes, I agree with your view that a formalization of consultative practice with the G20 will be a very helpful thing, because then it introduces predictability into the process. It allows us then to introduce processes whereby we secure the views of as many countries as possible and give it in a more coherent form. In Canada, we didn't have that much time. We just did some thinking on our own, and I think it was reasonable the way we did it. But we could not get many of the countries to speak for themselves because there was just not enough time. But if we have the other process, then we can do it in a much more coherent and in a much more organized way. On your first question of the G20 being able to be effective on development, that remains to be seen. I think the signs are very encouraging that this, a committee, a working group on development has been made, and that many of, as Shriti said just now, concerns of the developing world are not subsidiary matters for the G20, as many of these countries felt they were for the G8. The big problem is that if you haven't solved your global macroeconomic problems, like calibration of the value of international currencies, and biggest players in the G20 then see that as an arena where they must fight out this battle, then the agenda of the G20 gets hijacked by issues of this nature. And I hope that they're able to strike a balance between issues of this nature and developmental issues.
Thank you very much. Before I ask Dirk to come in, Simon asked, what's the G20 for? Do you want to...
Well, I think there were about 4 questions. I'm very happy to answer them, but I don't want to...
Yeah.
I know that Kamalesh has to go. So,
Yeah.
On process and representation, the G20 Development Working Group had on it representatives from the AU, NEPAD, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the and UNDP representing the UN. So that was its mechanism, and we went out specifically on a consultation. Some of the consultations were formal and some of them were informal. The formal one, for example, was that the Africans have formed a sort of C10, which is I don't quite know how they've chosen them. So I mean that's not but they've chosen it. So a group that expressed their views to us and what they wanted out of the agenda. And in fact, if you spoke to the AU and NEPAD, you will see that, frankly, huge chunks of the agenda, which I will go on to talk about, that in response to Simon's question, actually reflect what they told us, pretty much kind of in the same words. So that's how the consultation and representation was structured. And secondly, there's been a discussion about the institutionalization of the low-income countries on the G20. And I'm not sure whether I'm meant to announce this or not, but anyway, here it goes. That there will be, so far we have had, at every G20, we have had NEPAD and the AU represented. And I think we're just going to institutionalize it so that there will always be 2 Africans in addition to South Africa there. All of you are writing down, which makes me worry that I shouldn't have said it. But anyway, on the question of what can the G20 do, basically the G20 doesn't exist. I mean, it's like the G8. You know what I mean? It's a meeting, or a set of meetings. It's not a body. It's not an institution. If you were to say what's the institutionalization of it, I kind of represent the only one thing that's moved from one G20 to another G20 in any continuous way. But what it does have is mobilization power, which then fluctuates with its own coherence. And so, for example, on this development agenda, the way it will manifest itself, besides all the fine words in the communique, will be a multi-year action plan that will be attached to the communique, which has, under each of those pillars that I talked about, a set of actions. It will identify a group of actors who will mainly be not the G20 because they don't do anything, but it'll be the UNDP will do this, and the World Bank will do the other, and so will report back at this point, and then they come back and they report back. So it has an action plan and it has an accountability framework, and the G20 the development working group, and then the Sherpa group, and then the leaders will then have this process report back to it, so it can say, yeah, well, we said this should happen. Why hasn't it happened? Now we have to be careful because the G20 does not represent the board of the IMF or the board of the World Bank. I mean, it's 85% of global GDP, so it has a large number of the important shareholders of the World Bank and the just as an example. As far as the UN is concerned, GDP doesn't matter. It only has 20 countries out of 190, so you can't sort of direct it. But so it has mobilization plan. It's not compulsory that you pay any attention to what it says, but that is the way we have used it to create a kind of mandate of actions to be given to other people that need to be reported back. The other question you asked was about climate change, and I explained that people having stayed up for 36 hours to talk about round the clock to talk about just climate finance at St Andrews last November, and then it went into Copenhagen. The decision at Copenhagen, which was the decision of the UN and all of the world as represented in the UN, was a decision that the G20 has to abide by, which is it will not discuss climate change and climate finance. And a special body was set up to discuss climate finance and will report back to Cancun and to the Secretary-General. You know, the G20 does not have the legitimacy to stand up and say, we don't care what you think, we're going to discuss it anyway. In the first instance, that is the view of the majority of the countries of the world, that they didn't want the G20 discussing it. Of course, some of those countries are also represented in the G20, and you might guess who they were, but that is what it is. So it doesn't discuss climate change for that reason. On the bigger, wider question, which is, frankly, what the G20 does in its mainstream work of dealing with global imbalances and global growth actually affects poor people more than just about anything else it could do. I completely agree with that. And I think you could take the positive view or you could take the pessimistic view. And, you know, I'm possibly a bit tired and therefore I'm taking the pessimistic view. But the fact of that meeting existing, and the finance ministers' meeting is starting tomorrow and then Friday, and then the G20 is on the 11th. Have I got that right? That the fact of it existing is leading to all this noise. Basically because there is a structure and a process that has been set up, which is called a mutual assessment process for the 20 countries, we are in fact 24 countries, to discuss their 5-year projections of balance of payments, surpluses, structural reform, etc. They put forward, it's kind of a unique thing, it's never happened before, it's quite a unique experiment. They put it forward, it's meant to be mutual assessment, but the IMF is given the technical work to assess all of these plans, and it comes back and it says, well, you know, it doesn't add up to the sum of its parts. You want to have 4% global growth? Well, I can tell you those 24 plans are not going to add up to 4% global growth, or they will add up to 4% global growth, but they will have this degree of instability or downside risk because of imbalances. So that's really the process that has been ongoing since Pittsburgh. And that is the process that has led to all of this agitation with people going, okay, we know that the surpluses and the deficits are not going to quite add up, and what are you going to do about it? And that's really where a lot of this tension is emanating from, besides, you know, the obvious fact that it's emanating from a political imperative out of Congress, because, you know, renminbi is actually appreciated by 8% in real terms. But so that's what's happening, is the airing of this. Is it going to be able to come to a valid agreement? I don't know. This is not something that's easily solved, and is it going to have a huge impact if it doesn't? Yes. But people are working around the clock to try and get to some agreement of how these economies are going to run and function in a completely interconnected way over the next 5 years. And it's a little bit like the UN. There's no magic just because it's called the G20 and happened to have been very effective during a crisis. There's no magic in this. It can only represent the individual constituent parts. It can only represent the views of the individual constituent parts. It can't suddenly build something out of nothing. And if two major global players disagree, can't suddenly, because it's the G20, do something magical about it. So they've got to agree. And we're trying to work through every conceivable formulation in the next 3 weeks that are left to make it do that.
Brilliant. On that, are you with us for a bit longer?
I have to be somewhere at 6:30. I apologise to everyone. I apologise to you particularly. I don't mean any discourtesy. Alison knew the problem.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to get Dirk now to give a few reflections.